week on the show, we are delighted to have Zoë Whishaw. Zoë is a returning guest, and for those of you who've been listening since the beginning, she was on episode 14. Zoë is a photography consultant with many, many years of experience in the industry, and this week we're going to be discussing two areas that really affect every single photographer and visual artist that I know, and those are confidence and dealing with self-doubt. Zoë, welcome to the show.
Thank you, both of you. Lovely to be back.
Welcome back to the show. Yeah, very exciting. So obviously episode 14, we were much younger and a bit more sprightly, but also we had no idea what we were doing. So at least some things stay the same.
Well, and we were dealing with COVID. So my gosh, a lot going on.
Yeah, wow. Things are different. For example, people aren't working now. so the photography industry is different. No, but honestly, oh my God, jokes aside, how are you?
I'm really well, and it is so great to be back, and I didn't realise that you would be so willing to have me back, but I was just so taken, Tom, by an Instagram post that you posted recently, and I reacted to that immediately. And
let's get into this, because I when I get an email going, Tom, you've inspired me, I thought, well, okay, great, let's go. So yeah, so. This was
looking. Yeah, I wasn't looking. I was just, as one does, sort of enjoying a moment on Instagram, and I saw your post of the Chinook coming into land with the puffs of a sand or smoke or whatever it was, with Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, I think at the time, in the foreground. But it wasn't just the picture, actually. It was your commentary about how that picture had come about that was so striking. And this may not be obviously word for word what you wrote, and I do recommend other people go and have a look. But it was what you said, and from memory, it was to do with the fact that this picture had come about through. You'd had to create it in about 1 minute. The day had basically gone pear-shaped, it had changed shape, and very little time for thinking or considering how the picture would actually be. But in the end, you got this extraordinary shot, and it touched such a nerve with me, because it made me think, well, for goodness sake, don't let anyone think that this came about through luck and chance. While at some level it did, but
I was going to say there was a small element.
But you know what? It's such a small element, and so this then got me thinking, which is about, Tom, you got to that point where you were able to use what I believe very strongly in this, your unconscious, if you like, to take over in a time of kind of great stress and intensity, to allow your experience, the time you've been a photographer, all the other problems and failures and successes that you've had as a photographer, frankly, all distill into that one moment that you had to get something. And there's a lot of pressure, not least the location you were at, the tech or whatever it is that was flying around, and the person you were photographing. So I think Shall I
give a little bit of background to anyone who's not seen that picture? So we had, I spent the day with the outgoing Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, for the Sunday Times magazine, which then ended up running in the Times because his resignation was surprisingly announced. We didn't know it was coming. And I had spent the day with him. And so I've done a day with him previously, flying up and down the UK in Chinooks. And then we'd done another day, and we'd flown to somewhere in the Wirral. And I don't know if anyone's ever been in a Chinook, but they are loud. So long journeys in Chinooks, they are exhausting. But we flew up to the Wirral, where I'd shot him on a RFA Proteus. I don't know quite what the technical term is, but it basically goes out and does cool stuff at sea that's a bit secret. So, and I'm not allowed to talk about too much. Actually, I am, because I didn't see anything. But it's really cool. It sounds way more exciting if you're like, I know what's on it. Nothing was on it when I was on it. It was completely empty. But then we took off and then flew over to somewhere near Catterick, the barracks, to go and meet and watch. Again, don't know how much of this I'm actually allowed to talk about. There are Ukrainians being trained up by various armed forces from the UK and over Europe here in the UK. I'm probably allowed to say that. But we were there photographing them. with Ben Wallace, but I didn't get any more time really. I got a couple of portraits, but not really the hero one that I was after. And so then kind of everything had been pulled short. I got to the kind of the evac point where we were being met by the Chinook, and I suddenly went, like you say, the unconscious took over, and I suddenly was just like, do you know what? I feel like I haven't completed the job yet. There's got to be something else. There's got to be something. And I said, look, I can hear it coming. So I ran over to the Secretary of State and I said, look, I'm not going to say what I call him because get on with him now. So I was just like, look, you've got to come over here. This is what we're doing. The Chinook's getting louder and louder. I was like, we've got no time for this. He looked at his special advisors and they were like, yeah, go. This sounds brilliant. And I was like, oh, great, easy sell. So then we ran over. Obviously, the guys, the pilots didn't know this was happening. So we basically just stood and made it look as if we weren't going to go towards them. And then, as the Chinook landed, the sand all kicked up and the shot happened. But you're right, it's the unconscious. And it's the kind of the years of going, right, okay, I think I've got the job, but I haven't got the job, right?
Yeah, and I think that what struck me in you recounting the story, as well as what I think you wrote and what I therefore saw and kind of assumed, is that confidence, you must have had an element of confidence to create that shot. But what I wrote also in the comments, I said something like, I bet there was lots of sort of fear and trepidation and sort of, a lot of prep the day before or a few days before, notwithstanding. But the fact is, you just got on with it. And it got me thinking, well, what is confidence? How does it manifest itself? And what does it feel like when somebody does have confidence?
Well, shall I be super open with you? I think if that job had happened 18 months ago, that shot wouldn't have happened. After COVID, I had a huge knock to my confidence. I wasn't really liking my work. I wasn't really happy with what I was producing. There were technical aspects of it as well. Regular listeners will know that I've moved a couple of camera systems. And so about 18 months, maybe 2 years ago, I came back over to Canon. And then it was a bit of a rocky start and I wasn't really happy with anything. And then I changed my lighting systems. But now I'm finally happy. But COVID was a really big instigator of a huge confidence knock. I've always been pretty confident. And I've always just not kind of just like been a bull in a china shop, but I've always been maybe slightly overconfident. And COVID completely took that out away from me. I had it way, way easier than a lot of other people as well. So, but I can only obviously speak from my personal experience. But now I feel like I'm back. And over the 18 months, I've built that confidence back up to the point where I'm like, no, this shoot isn't done. This is what needs to be done. I am doing this. And regardless of whether I upset people or not now, I'm just like, look, I'll be very gentle. Let me rephrase that. Regardless of how I, no, again, I will just always make sure that people are happy. I'm never going to make people do things that they aren't happy with. But at that point, for example, when you've got the Chinook coming in, you just go, we have got 35 seconds to get this done. It'll look amazing. And this is what the shot that everyone will want from it is. And then it's that kind of 25 seconds of managing to try and convince everyone and then organize people. And I feel that now I've got my confidence back. And I really hope if people also had lost a lot of confidence after COVID, I hope that they've got that back as well. But for me, it's been a real concerted effort to work on myself, work on my skills, work on my confidence. And so as a result, I now feel like I'm a bit more back to where I was.
And I think that speaks to something that's so important about how to build confidence, how to invite it, and that is introspection. And that is a lot of, sometimes I think one's almost got to go through these difficulties, these tests, what is par for the course for all creatives, I think, is to almost have the knowledge that knockbacks are going to happen, and not to invite them, but to accept them. And I think, I work with photographers who have actually, in one way or another, have tried to create a sort of a carapace, which is, I suppose, more of a scientific term. It's almost like a protection, like an armor plating, to almost protect them from negativity or bad feedback. But actually, what I found through working with photographers like this, and we are talking often about commercial photography, but I think fine art, I'm sure comes into this as well. But the knocks are actually there to create a bit of a crack, to allow certain vulnerability to express itself, because it's through that vulnerability that actually some truth can come out. Because when you've got this sort of armor plating, you become quite brittle. And you cannot grow. I mean, yes, if one keeps the analogy going of sort of an insect that can't move past its tight skin. So I think that what you were talking about maybe with COVID and what's happened to you in the last few years is that you've kind of gone through this iteration of self-doubt, perhaps, which I think is slightly different to a lack of confidence. And then we've got the imposter syndrome. All of these things we'll perhaps keep talking about. But I think it's so important to have that introspection, time for introspection, and know that that's actually part of what being a photographer or any creative is all about.
Well, if it helps, I feel now that I'm a much, much better photographer, technically, and as a person, as a result of having worked through those changes. Sorry, Greg, you had a point.
No, I was going to say that with the interesting thing here for listeners ultimately is that confidence is something that it's not set. You don't just get it and then keep it.
No.
And you can lose it, and it can be something that you don't expect that can just really knock your confidence. And so I guess for our listeners, and what's going to be really interesting is hearing what your thoughts are, Zoe, on how you maintain that confidence, how you grow that confidence, how you get over imposter syndrome, or how you frame it. Because I think those are the type of tools that any creative really needs to have in their armory, because ultimately that has to come from within. And so often people aren't given those tools. If they're working for themselves day in, day out, they're not going to have a frame, or a structure around them that's going to provide those tools. So you have to seek it out yourself.
And I think that if we could almost draw a graph of confidence versus competence, I think that there's a hugely important connection between the two. That in the early days of a photographer's career, there's relatively little competence, but there might be quite a lot of confidence, which could be actually arrogance. Which again is because maybe especially if you've had early success, and you might think, oh well, this is great, and I'm doing fine. But if you think about so this is why I think I talked to you, Greg, about what I wanted to talk a bit about today. I think time is an incredibly important feature in developing confidence, because developing competence, of course, has to happen over time. So as you develop greater competence, which is to do with the skill sets you have, which is about and this is a really key part. I think some photographers are comforting themselves by perhaps staying in a certain zone and using certain kind of techniques, and that is their go-to and what they want to be known for. But actually, how important is it to make sure that your range of skills are quite broad? And I often think about this, relating it to somebody like Picasso, who had a very broad and deep and classic education with his painting and his drawing, but chose to abstract and chose to minimize and later on in his career. So I think the same with photography. It's so important to build your competence, so your range of skills, and then choose what it is you want to use, so that you aren't caught off track just for a moment when you really need to in fact sort of pull on some knowledge that you actually. So in other words, something I'd like to encourage all photographers to do is to have that introspection about their own skill set. Are there gaps? Are there gaps because you want the gaps, or because by default gaps have appeared or occurred, or that you've never, the way you've taught yourself, or you've always assumed that you only want to use natural light and you don't want to sort of have the concerns of artificial. So the competence level can be developed, and the breadth and the depth can be built through making sure that you have a good skill set. so that's, you know, in time you choose which part of those skill sets you want. So it's funny, this morning I was talking to my father, who's 93. He's a fine art painter and he's a Royal Academician, so he's had some success. And I was asking him, you know, do you ever sort of lack confidence? And he said, well, of course I lack confidence in some things. And I said, well, you know, how do you overcome that? And together, because he's quite elderly now, he came up with this lovely term, which was, I said, so you've got all these different range of skills and techniques that you can use. And he said, oh, but it's not only that. I said, oh, it's like you've got a toolbox. He said, yes, but actually it's the ideas box, which is important. Now, what he meant by that was that your competency is based, of course, on how you can do something and the range of skills you've got to actually treat. But the ideas you have is what will sustain you and what will allow you to develop your sense of self, so we can talk about that, because Greg, I know you'd quite like to talk probably about this idea of motivation and inspiration and confidence and how they're all brought together. But this idea of having an ideas box is part of your way of building competency. And as you build your competency and your ability to create your imagery, your confidence goes up. But in time, you know, as you develop your career, it can go through dips where you think you know nothing because you haven't yet perhaps expressed or stretched your ideas enough. You might be stuck in one, but rather going back to the last podcast we did where we talked about the idea of being in a bit of a comfort zone. If one stays in that comfort zone, that's where the stretching really doesn't allow one to develop, you know, creatively. So just sort of going back to that idea of how to build confidence, the more competent you are in terms of your skill set, the fact that you know what you are about as a visual artist or a visual creator, that will start to develop one's confidence. And I think too many photographers don't think about that last bit I just talked about, which is, what are you about? So you know, what's your value as a photographer? Because if you are able to understand how unique you are, you're going to start to build this inner confidence that people will come to you because of who you are. I mean, confidence expresses itself in, or lack of confidence, in so many different ways. I mean, of course, it's all about, you know, do you dare to sort of, you know, ring up this person that you hardly know? You know, is it about sort of talking to clients that you've never spoken to before? Is it about, you know, knocking on someone's door because you want to take their portrait? I mean, there's so many ways that confidence needs to express itself, aren't there? But I think it would also be useful to sort of touch in on what self-doubt is all about, because self-doubt, in fact, just today on the BBC website, there was a little story about Michael Parkinson, who, in case anyone listening to this isn't sure who he is, he's a very well-respected, sadly died the other day, celebrity interviewer. And apparently he used to suffer from terrible imposter syndrome, which is, you know, hard to believe, and yet perhaps it's not hard to believe, because I think probably nearly all of us in one way or another have got an imposter syndrome. But self-doubt, on the other hand, so self-doubt, I think, and imposter syndromes, they've got some very interesting sort of similarities. I think self-doubt is about whether or not you feel a fraud, or you don't quite belong, or whether are you good enough. And I think that the imposter syndrome is about whether or not, you know, you're in the right skin almost. You know, do you actually fit in? Is your background the wrong background to be where you are? So all of this plays into, you know, sort of confidence as well. I mean, I don't know whether either of you have felt the imposter syndrome side of things, or particularly, because it's worth photographers hearing from yourselves.
Yeah, well. I feel imposter syndrome every time we start a recording with a podcast. Like, honestly, it's a very that's not a joke. I thought I'd get a laugh, but the trouble is with it, you kind of go, well, actually, what are my qualifications to talk like this? Other than the fact that, you know, now we're heading towards our 50th episode, but you know, we just started it because we're just a couple of mates who thought that starting a podcast was a good idea. that's our qualifications. Greg's a bit more qualified than I am, but like that's the qualifications. So I do kind of sit down and I just go, right, let's go. This will be all right, because actually, we bear a lot of ourselves on this show, and so it's always kind of like, oh, I hope people don't judge me too harshly, or people don't judge me for what I say, but that's self-doubt as well. So it's I don't know. I don't tend to feel it with my work so much, but go on, Greg.
Interested with that kind of crossroads that you came to about the ideas box. I kind of wanted to touch on that again, because for me, the kind of the confidence and the self-doubt and then the idea of an ideas box are quite interesting, because there are some shoots where I'll do loads of prep and put together mood boards, come up with kind of things I want to try. And then there are other shoots where I'll literally just turn up and choose to react. And it's interesting the type of different work you get if you go with no expectations and you try to just respond instinctively to what you see in front of you, versus going with a real set mindset and then getting frustrated if you can't kind of get the images that you had in your head. And I think obviously the interplay there of confidence and self-doubt and all of that comes into it. And I also wanted to highlight that, as we touched on earlier, the thing with confidence is that knock can be one job that doesn't go the way you hoped it would go, because they always say, you're only as good as your last photo. And if you take an assignment on or a commission on and you go and you do it and then you're not happy with it, which personally I'd say is probably for me 85% of shoots I do, I'll come back and be like, yeah, it's okay, but it's not spectacular, It's so there's an aspect there of how your barometer, and how you choose to judge yourself.
I do think though, if you come away from every shoot, it's and go, I have smashed that, chances are you probably haven't. It's like when I was at school and did exams, and like there were some exams that I'd find really hard, and I'd come out and be like, oh geez, that was tough. Like, then I'd come out of some exams and I'd be like, smash that. Absolutely smashed it. Easy. Easiest thing I've ever done. And I would normally fail the easy ones and I would do really well in the hard ones. It's the same. I think with shoots, if you come away and you're like, nailed every single image, well, you should be challenging yourself then. If you're not feeling like if there's no room for improvement, you can't just coast like that.
So, the analogy is so interesting because it works in so many areas of the creative industry. Again, having this discussion with my elderly father, I said, so what's it like when, perhaps people are not buying the work as you'd want them to? And he said, well, that makes me wonder why. And I said, and what do you feel like when you've sold out in a little show or something? He said, well, but I also wonder why. So that the point is that you don't actually always want things to always, as you were saying, Tom, to work well, because it means you're not stopping to think. So that and my father also said, and I relate to him because he's such an immensely inspiring man who's been working for over 70 years in a very intensely fine art and self sort of introspective sort of arena, which I realise is not the commercial world at all, but it's got very, very interesting parallels. That when things are not going well and he's knocked back, which, Greg, you're suggesting maybe that's almost 80% of the time with some of the work, and that's a very personal sort of expression of what's happening. I'm sure your clients are very happy. But from a personal point of view, what it makes it makes him more determined. So it says it makes him determined to find a solution to why something is not working.
Oh, 100%. I think you have to have that mindset of quite often you'll come away and the client will be very, very happy, but it doesn't mean you're going to be happy necessarily, because you know what you wanted to get out of something or what you could have got out of something if something else had gone differently. I guess what listeners are going to want to try and figure out is what are the questions that they should be asking in order to really think about what works, what doesn't work, how they build confidence. It's almost like we need to come up with a toolkit for people, because as you said, it's an incredibly introspective career, and a lot of people just simply, it's a different thing if you're having those conversations with other people, because it naturally come up. But a lot of photographers I know aren't having those conversations with other people. They're having them internally in their minds. And, quite often that's a one-way conversation that doesn't lead to much unless you ask the right questions of yourself.
Well, I think also a lot of people, and people we know, I think a lot of people have a lot of people dwell, right? So when you come away from a shoot and things maybe haven't gone quite how you thought, you beat yourself up about it. Well, actually, what's the point? There is nothing that can be done. The shoot is done. Everything is ended. You now need to just take stock and be like, okay, well, that was a mistake. I will not have that happen again. How do I stop that from happening again? Okay, I need to do this. I need to carry gaff tape. I need to make sure that this always happens. I saw this great, there's this Japanese principle of life called Kaizen. We've talked about it plenty of times on the show before, and it is incremental improvements at every step. You kind of go, well, every single time you step in away from a shoot, I go, all right, what went well? What could do with improvement? With every single thing, like we try and do it with the podcast. Every single episode we improve. There's a YouTuber called Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast did a video that I watched a couple of months ago, and he said, to succeed at YouTube, if you do 100 videos and you improve one thing every single time, and you just have to keep improving. So don't dwell on anything. Dwelling only creates a spiral. It has no benefit to you or anyone else. Maybe ring a photographer, and have like friends that you can just be like, oh, I can't believe that happened. How would you stop that from happening again? If you can't think of the question.
Tom, so it's so interesting that you say that, because one of my main points that I'd love every photographer to sort of, or anybody actually, and regardless of whether it's about the creative industry or not, how to build confidence. And I just use the word stretch. It's about wherever one is at the moment, think to yourself, how can I just have that small, it doesn't have to be big, it's a bit, you were just saying this, Tom, there's a small extra step beyond where I am now that will stretch me in some way, that will push. So, and it just goes back to what my our previous discussion was, which is about the danger of being in the comfort zone. It's just stepping outside what feels comfortable. And that inevitably is going to test you. Have I got the skill set I need? You were saying, well, did I bring the gaffer tape or not? Well, actually, maybe I need to learn a whole new set of lighting or whatever it might be, and so that introspection is good, but also how am I going to step up next time to some small level? So it's about constantly making sure that there's an element of stretch in one's one's life in general, I'm sure personal as well as professional life, because that's going to grow the competency, and it's going to help with those knocks that one has to assume the rejection and the negative feedback. It is par for the course. And I think, as you were saying, Greg, most photographers do work in isolation to some extent, or rather they find it much harder to be able to be this open and to be this vulnerable, actually, to talk about how they feel sort of a bit less than at times. And in fact, vulnerability, such an important word to sort of touch on for a minute. There's this amazing woman called Brené Brown. Other people may have mentioned her, I'm not sure, but there's a TED talk, and maybe we can put this in the notes at the end, a link to this. There's a TED talk by Brené Brown. I think it's only about 20 minutes on the power of vulnerability, and how it goes back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, this idea of trying not to protect yourself to the point at which you don't allow yourself to be vulnerable and to be open, because creatives are going to get knocked, and they have to learn from it, and they have to be the ones that are almost inviting others to comment on what they're doing in order that they can grow. So it's a very, very powerful 15 or 20 minute TED talk, which I think it'd be great for people to listen to, about, the power of vulnerability. But the other thing about, just going back to the self-doubt thing, somebody who, I don't know a great deal about, but I remember reading about 10 years ago on the BBC, again, we can put a link to this, Alistair Campbell. who, political strategist for Tony Blair many, many years ago, suffers from not only depression as it happens, but chronic self-doubt. I mean, who would think it? And I know anyone in the UK knows a comedy series called The Thick of It, based, I think, very much on him. You would never think that someone... Anyway, the point about self-doubt, he talks about, I think it's Galileo who said that self-doubt is the father of all invention. In that, to stop and think, either because somebody has critiqued your work or you're criticizing, your own approach, to a job you've just done or your own personal work. It's that introspection. It is unnerving. And it does probably give you sleepless nights, but this is all part of the process of growth. Otherwise you're sealing yourself in. So, what he talks about, Alistair Campbell, is preparation. That for him, and I think one can sort of extrapolate this into preparing for shoots, or maybe you have the idea of self-doubt and a forthcoming big shoot that's coming. But prepare. Sort of unpick questions, and this is another thing my father touched on today. Think of alternatives. If something's not working, maybe walk away. And this is maybe in a personal project you might be doing. Walk away from it. Remember, if you've got your ideas box, or whatever we like to call it, to rifle in and get a bit lost in and get a bit chaotic with. Mm-hmm. Allow for that, because that is where you may find a huge revival of energy come to you, when you least expect it. And in fact, it reminds me of a photographer came to see me some years ago, who I won't mention her name because she's doing quite well now, and felt very, very lost and hadn't been doing any personal projects for a while. And I know that, you probably both know I bang on about personal projects a lot. But she went away, slightly convinced by the idea of doing some personal work, but not quite sure what she might do. And she got back to me about 3 or 4 weeks later. This is about 10 or so years ago. And she said to me, "My God, Zoe, I've got this renewed energy. I thought that, frankly, my career was almost over. But I fiddled about. I had a bit of a creative afternoon. It didn't go very well. It didn't matter. But I found something new, a new sort of source of energy," she called it. And that in itself, so confidence, I think, and energy, positive energy, are interestingly linked. And I think that leads to motivation. And the motivation to move forward is what brings confidence. So there's this incredible cycle, which is very powerful when you just get on and do it. Mm-hmm. So I think that if you're feeling, slowed down, or feeling as if, the creative juices are just not flowing, there's very little. Sometimes one's got to walk away, but then dip into this, and we perhaps should explore what this box contains, actually, or could contain.
It's interesting you say that. So I obviously shoot a huge amount of personal projects. I would like to shoot more personal projects than I would commissions, but obviously that's not quite how the world works. For me, though, what you've just said there about walking away from stuff or just taking a moment, we had this the other day. I was shooting a model in the studio, and I just couldn't quite get it. I just couldn't quite get what I was after. So I took everything down, I moved all the lights away, I spun everything out, and I was just like, right, okay, come back to it. We kind of had a drink, we had a chat, we had a laugh, listened to some music. 5 minutes later, came back, put everything in, first shot. I was like, boom, great. And it's cool.
But
no
Tom,
extra stress.
I think it takes confidence to do that.
Yeah, I think also just experience of just realizing that just doing it over and over, and when you're obviously doing something that isn't working, to then just keep flogging that dead horse, it just is no good for anyone. So to just take a break and have like a minute, for me personally, been a really good thing.
So that's where I believe that experience and time are such an important feature in building confidence. I mean, as I say, anyone listening to this who's at the early sort of part of their career, do know that it's something that does come with time, but you of course have to facilitate it. It doesn't come on its own, and it can't come through anybody else but your own endeavors and the way you react to what comes to you. And I think this word iterative. I do love this word iterative, which means things grow. It's a bit like compound interest, I suppose. Things, the more you expose yourself to mistakes, problems, failures, and the more you then are introspective about it and you work through it, you deconstruct, you move forward, and you work with what's happened as a result of it. It's all additive, and this again adds to this word competency. I'm talking about, which then in itself is a function of, if we're talking almost mathematically, is a function of directly proportional to your level of confidence. So there will be knocks, whatever, along the way throughout. But as I say, it's about expecting them, because I think some photographers perhaps assume, especially if they've had early success, that it's just going to go swimmingly. But it is not. It is not in any career. No. But to constantly sort of look inwards at what. Here's something that I've often thought about. Am I being selected or chosen as the go-to photographer for this job because of my own values, my own style, and my own sense of self, or am I being selected because I am a service provider? Now, there's a huge difference between these two two main. So being a service provider, I suppose, is less about being selected because you interpret ideas or you have ideas that are interpretive. You are more selected because you're competent with your camera. And so for example, e-commerce photography, or perhaps some headshot photographers, they're doing a very good job in that arena, but they're not necessarily being asked to be interpretive. Versus, so photographers I've worked with in those arenas can often find their confidence quite shallow and quite insubstantial, because they've never been tested beyond what they've been asked to do. And often the way for them is to work and understand and to work through some personal work, because they're not really being asked to interpret anything or very much in the work they do. And it opens the whole world up, versus photographers who have spent years and decades indeed working on their personal interests, their personal style, the way they interpret ideas, what they're interested in. This is the ideas box that has to be filled and has to be nurtured and constantly explored. And this is what makes a photographer unique, because that box is filled with who they are, what their personal experiences have been, what's happened in their life, good, bad, or whatever. It's all part of this marvelous mix of how they got to be a photographer in the first place, which of course can, bring up the whole imposter thing. They may not have ever studied it. They may never have done any assisting. All of this is part of every photographer's journey. And there's no right and there's no wrong and there's no one way. But all of these, so this business of what makes a photographer unique is what, and if a photographer can help to appreciate that they are unique, this can in itself just untap a level of confidence. It might be small to start off with, but what I find with so many photographers I work with is that understanding that they do have a personal journey that matters, and that their story and their approach to their work and their expertise and their obsessions, their fascinations are totally part of their story and what matters to other people, and what makes them unique, and therefore what they should feel comfortable and confident about, and how they should find a language that they can express that. And that's something that I do a lot of work with photographers, because one needs to be able to express it.
I think there's one thing that people struggle with is that there's, if you study photography at university, you have crit sessions where you will sit down and you will actually critique one another's work and talk about the work that you've created, and that helps to kind of cement ideas in your mind about what maybe drove you to do the work or what you were trying to explore with the work. But for the majority of working photographers, they just don't have that. When people used to shoot predominantly film and you'd be spending time in the lab, you might have those discussions with other photographers. But nowadays, unless you kind of share studio with photographers, or you spend a lot of time at private views and kind of industry events, which quite often means you have to live near one of the hubs, and be able to make those events, then it's difficult to actually have those discussions which help you develop ideas about your work. So part of the reason for the podcast really in some ways to actually give an outlet for people to discuss things and talk about things, because there just isn't that for a lot of photographers.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know, I guess my advice would be to try and find, Tom talks about his board of advisors, and I think having that, for me it's the other photographers I share a studio with, is to be able to sit down and say, listen, I've done this work, there's something about it's just not working, can you just look at it? Because it's incredibly difficult to look at your own work and to pinpoint what your strengths and weaknesses are, what's working, what's not working. And like you've discussed, your kind of your USP, it's very difficult to actually be aware of what your USP is. It sometimes takes somebody else to be like, I really like the way that you do this, and you're like, I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah, to tease that out is it's a very, very difficult thing for other people to do as well, because that's where the objectivity, perhaps a lot of what I do can help, because it's about, without fear or favor, being able to explain and express sort of what works and what doesn't work in somebody's pictures, but explaining why, not just to say that doesn't quite work, but why doesn't it work? But just going back to Greg, what you were saying about how there's very little of this sort of interaction, perhaps, these days. I do think that that's something that photographers need to, especially post-COVID. I think there's still a little bit of apathy about getting out and about, or assuming that social media is still the way to do it. But you know what? It's so important to not fear the criticism that somebody may give you with your work, but to actually invite it. Because one doesn't have to actually accept it all. You may not agree, but it's really good to consider it and to see if there are patterns that are emerging through what some feedback may be having. So I think, finding local collectives of photographers who might meet once a month, once every 2 months, or obviously portfolio reviews, or, actually meeting on a one-to-one, and making a big effort, I think is a hugely important thing, because isolation in itself can breed an awful lot of introspection, but quite negatively, if there isn't that chance to bounce ideas and just express, what you're currently working on. Yeah, so I think something else I was just thinking about, how it's this idea of just getting on with it and shooting. I think when you've got a bit of downtime, but also wedging in some time in between the jobs if one's very busy, because just being busy is not necessarily everybody's measure of success, nor should it be, because being busy is you could be like a headless chicken. So I think one's got to try and unearth and work out what one's measure of success is. I think that's really important, and I think that will change with time anyway. But I think whatever happens, one should find time for these personal projects, because it is a muscle, and I think that the more you do it, the more you're going to grow that ability to invent new ideas and new ways of challenging yourself, new ways of problem solving. Which then comes back down to jobs that don't go your way, or while you're on a job, just like Tom with your recent one we were talking about. How do you spin on a dime when you need to? And spinning on a dime is just that moment where, you had to problem solve just like that, and somewhere your unconscious reached into some experience that you've had, maybe not on a paid job, but possibly on a personal job, that actually has answered that for you, probably at an unconscious level. But it is like a muscle that has to sort of be exercised, and it has to be challenged, and it has to be stretched. So if there's another sort of point I'd like people to go away with, is not just being stretched, but making sure that there is that regular push to innovate, to test, to not necessarily complete personal projects, because they can take time, and they can take an awful lot of effort, which is a very good thing, and that there's a huge journey within each of those. But testing, push yourself to try something you've never worked on before, even if it's not something you feel you want to, it's a particular treatment that you ever want to use again, it's good to test yourself with it, because that's all part of the stretch. It's all part of the toolbox, the actual toolbox, never mind the ideas box, which you might have to reach into when you least expect it. And that builds confidence, knowing that you can just reach for it and it'll be there when you need it.
From a gear point of view, that's fine. I've got to talk about gear, right? There's also, the more and more you do tests, the more and more you do the smaller jobs and the things, and the more and more you're shooting, especially from an early point in your career up to kind of, someone who's really experienced, for example, you then start perfecting, again, going back to Kaizen, you improve your bag, your kit and everything like that. So you then effectively don't have a camera bag, you have a survival pack, right? Like the camera bag is obviously has tools in it, but it really is there it's kind of a sum of your experience. Like, for example, when I worked in music, I had a set of dice and a pack of cards, because we would wait for people to turn up to shoots for hours. And we didn't. I kind of had like an unwritten rule that we wouldn't really be on our phones because it was a bit rude. But we would play CeeLo. We wouldn't necessarily gamble, but we would do like poker. We'd have CeeLo, but it was like, how many people pack cards and dice for things like that. And my camera bag now has got so many odd, weird little things. Like, it's got plastic filter removers hidden down the side and like all sorts of stuff, because once, about 9 years ago, I couldn't get a filter off, and so those plastic filter removers have been with me the rest of my career and will continue to be so.
Well, Tom, were you ever a scout? Because it sounds like you are prepared.
Well, funny story about the scouts. I was asked to leave.
Perhaps you weren't prepared enough back then, but you sound prepared. I mean, going back to what we were saying, I mean, it's this business of being prepared. So whenever something is happening to you, when you could actually fall, flat on your face, as it metaphorically, and not be able to come up with the goods, your experience over time has led you to know that these little bits and bobs are there to, save you, basically.
Yeah, and also I think, I'm a decent amount of years in on this. There's very, very few, and I'm not saying that there's never going to be a situation I've never been put in before, but there's very few situations I haven't found myself in. I've had now hundreds and hundreds of shoots, probably in the thousands, and for the life of me, there's always been something that I've taken away from every single shoot.
Yeah.
So that's thousands of hours of shooting experience. That, and going back to the improvement, I've always been, I basically had some counselling the other week. It turns out I have small bits of process addiction, and that is, I create processes. But one of my big processes, and I would say my kind of like longest going process, has been incremental improvement over the years on every single shoot, doing something slightly differently. And I kind of hope, I personally feel that very confidently I have become better as a result. I think it would be terrible if I hadn't, made a concerted effort to really improve. And if it had gone the other way, not doing it right.
But I think if we think about photographers that might be listening who are in the early stages of their career, it can probably feel quite sort of daunting to think, wow, Tom's been working at this for some time, and how do I get to the point where you feel comfortable in your unconscious being able to help you at times when you've got 1 minute with a Chinook flying and all the rest of it. And I think some of the answer to this is about acceptance of the fact that in the early days, you aren't probably shooting everything you want to be shooting. You are going to make mistakes. You aren't only just as good as your last job, I don't think. Yes, that client, you may never get that client back again, but that does not mean to say that if you did a bad job, that's not your big spur to be introspective, to think, how you can move forward and all the rest of it. And it's very normal in the early days to feel that imposter, to feel that, because we are all novices at the beginning of anything. I mean, just thinking of we were talking about this before we started recording, about being parents. everybody is a novice, say, when you're a new parent. We don't know what we're doing. We're self-doubt and imposter. I've never done this before, but, you just have to, you talk to friends, you read books, you learn on the job, as it were. And my child is 15, so I've still got loads to learn. There's lots of confidence issues even based around that. Just because I've gone through the 15 years of it doesn't mean to say that there aren't always new confidence issues to be looked at and to be explored. So even though Tom, you've and Greg, of course, have had a lot of experience, and you've got all these fantastic metaphorical actual tools in your toolbox and ideas box, doesn't mean to say that's all finished now. You've got no more areas or need for imposter syndrome and all the rest of it. So any photographer listening to this, at whatever stage in your career, it is normal and it's healthy to have phases of introspection, phases of self-doubt, because that self-doubt my belief is that it's a spur to ask questions, to dig deep and to test your ideas, to face alternatives that maybe you've always assumed have worked, and then to jump in and get on with something different, to test yourself and to innovate.
Well, that's exactly it. For me, I never want to not have an element of self-doubt or not have an element of imposter syndrome. I want that. Obviously, I don't want it to the point where I've had it in the past where it's crushing and it feels really hard to even pick the camera up. But I do want elements of it because it drives me.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, okay, well, hang on a minute. I know I deserve to be here, but why? And I now need to show why I deserve to be here. It's, and the work and stuff, when a shoot has gone to hell, everyone in the room is going, oh God, I want to be that guy to step up and be like, okay, everyone take 5. We're going to strike everything. We're going to flip it all around, come back in 5 minutes, go outside for a cigarette, go outside for a drink, listen to some music, whatever, come back, everything will be fine. And, I always want that element, just a small element. Obviously, you don't want it too much, but that for me is going to always be a really useful thing to drive me forward, hopefully to constantly try and improve. Because if you get to the point and you're like, no, I'm God's gift, everything's fine, everything's great, then you're going to be coasting. From a creative point of view, there's not going to be anything. You're just going to do the same thing, not try anything new, not push any boundaries, not make yourself feel uncomfortable. And that for me just seems like what a boring place to be.
So you've brought something else up in my mind, which I think is quite interesting, which is that as one develops one's career, you realise the importance of surrounding yourself and your team, if you're dealing with a big enough shoot that needs a team, of other competent people who you are there to direct. I mean, I'm talking models here. I'm talking producers, hair and makeup stylists, and so forth, and assistants, of course. And with time, again, as we've said, and your own level of sort of competencies, you're then starting to rely on others around you who are there to help you deliver. And so the confidence then is about how you communicate just as you just described. Let's go out for a break or whatever. And I learnt this myself when I was art directing, bigger and bigger shoots, to the point at which I was project managing and directing, if you like, 250 models with about 4 photographers in a stadium. It was a fake stadium shoot, football thing, to the point at which one gets to. You have to be confident in the decisions that you make to make this happen. And I always remember being told how, as a manager, which you're a director when you've got this team around you, it's really important to make a decision, and with a positive, affirmative sort of tone, if you like. Whether it's the right decision or not, one hopes it is more often than not. But the idea that people are reliant on you to have that level of conviction in what you're saying, to appear confident. So here's an interesting example of, I read this recently, where if you were to ask 2 people how to get somewhere that needs a car journey, and you were to say to one person, what do you think is the best way to get from here to there? Is it to go through the city or to go round the coast? And one person answers, Now, do you know what? If you go through the city, then it might be rush hour, and it might, yeah. So it's probably a good idea to go round the coast. If you ask the other person and they say, "Oh, definitely to go round the coast. I've done that before." Who would you most want to ask a similar question to again? Even though the answer's the same, it's that second person that sounds like, even though they weren't sounding arrogant, they'd just done it before, and both have probably done the same journey before. But there's just, I suppose, a way of helping yourself with self-confidence is to just use affirmative language rather than a sort of. I'm not saying the first person was dithering. They were actually giving some quite useful. Well, they said might be this, but the second person was confident, not arrogant. There's a huge difference between confidence and arrogance. Tom, the way you described earlier, moments ago about the idea of arrogantly saying, people can see through that and nobody wants to work with anyone like that. So I think this touches on another way, Greg, you was thinking, well, how can we help people think of building confidence? It's about finding a positive, affirmative language around the work that you do. And I call this a visual language, and I help a lot of photographers to break down sort of the way they, if you like, pitch their themselves and what they do to others. And if it's done in a way that's confident, with a sprinkling of aspiration, but not arrogant, and very, very truthful and authentic, it sounds like you're on the front foot rather than potentially the back foot, which is what that silly example I just gave, although that first person sounded a bit unsure, but they kind of knew it was the right way. The second person was direct. Yeah, that's the way. It's definitely faster. So I suppose something for people to think about is, how do they communicate what they do to people they don't know, who could be potential clients, who are indeed our clients, in a way that's got that affirmative truth about it. And that does that's not easy to do. It does need some help. It's a bit like Greg, you were saying earlier, to try and tease that out of people is quite hard, but it's definitely doable. And what I find, so many photographers that come to me, this is what just puts them on the right track of feeling more confident about their practice, because they're able to communicate what they do in a way that doesn't sound fake, and it sounds truthful. And that can be a bit of magic, but and a lot of photographers feel very uncomfortable about talking about what they do. But that's something that at a very baseline, whatever level and whatever stage of photography you're at in your photography career, it can be remarkably helpful to explore that.
Well, one thing, I remember many, many years ago going to a talk that you did at Photo Fusion in Brixton. It was part of the Creative Network, I believe. And I remember you saying that you need to have an elevator pitch about yourself as a photographer. You just meet somebody and you've got 30 seconds to explain what it is you do. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, that's a really important and powerful thing. And then going away and trying to figure out what my elevator pitch was and finding it very difficult to do. So what tips would you give people to try and tease out, are there exercises that people can do or ways that they can be looking at their work to try and work out what it is that they're bringing to the table? Because I 100% agree that we have to be more than service providers. Never more so than now, with the threat of AI and all of this kind of increased tech, which has made it a very democratic process. The only way you stand out as a photographer is by bringing something unique to the table. And even better if you can communicate what exactly that is, because you're going to need to be able to sell yourself to people. And a lot of photographers are uncomfortable doing that because the balance between selling yourself and coming across as quite arrogant or full of yourself is a fine line. So do you have any kind of tips in your experience of how you kind of dig down into what it is that you might be doing that's different to everyone else?
It's a big question, because every photographer is different, and it can be sometimes a bit like opening up that sort of armor plating, which some photographers have spent years and years sort of cultivating, to say, I'm this kind of, having a very shiny off-pat sort of textbook sort of pitch, which actually is a bit repetitive. It's a bit boring, and 1,000 people may have said it. If you try not to imagine that you're trying to sell yourself, for one, because selling yourself is a fairly horrible sort of a low level of communication where somebody's trying to push something onto you that you probably don't want. So much better to see this as trying to transfer enthusiasm,
Right.
because that is very persuasive. Because we're all very social creatures and we're very interested in other people. So genuine enthusiasm about what you are interested in. So you start off, yes, I'm a photographer and I mostly photograph people. I mean, one can get the nuts and bolts out of the way. But the next bit really is about, what are you interested in as a photographer? So my work, is predominantly based around, people's, experiences. I don't know. I'm not going to do this sort of live now because maybe I'm just thinking of, Tom, of some of your recent portraits. Think in your mind of a recent project or a recent personal project or a recent shoot that you've just produced, a commission shoot, which you feel particularly proud of or excited by or helped you to think, well, this is why I'm a photographer. And to communicate what you were trying to achieve through this one or several series of pictures, that in itself can get people to understand what kind of photographer you are, what are you trying to achieve, and what your motivations are. Mm-hmm. And if you can then, and this is a little bit longer than 30 seconds, but not an awful lot longer, so long as you can bring in some genuine emotions as to what you are trying to achieve and what you are looking to achieve in your photography. So, for example, you might say, something I'm particularly interested in is the subtlety in body language through, detailed portrait work. It's not necessarily sort of, people looking to camera. It's all the subtle, notions of expression. So if somebody can paint a picture in their mind of the type of work you do, that's what will stick. And if you say, and if you can communicate with this with some enthusiasm, so genuine passion, and I hate that word because it's overused. With excitement, maybe that's another word. By talking about a project you've just done, and then people can actually visualize it in their mind. You're nearly all the way there. So I think for photographers to, know what the basics are. Do you photograph people? Are you a lifestyle photographer, food photographer, still life? What kind of photographer are you? And then get into what motivates you and excites you about taking pictures. That to me is one of the best kind of pictures you could have, because people will sense your enthusiasm and the emotion that you bring to your work. Does that make sense?
Completely.
Yeah.
Completely. I think that's a lovely spot maybe to kind of round up. I think if you guys are all right to do that, I think that was a really nice kind of spot. I think also a lot of people will just go, "Oh, I'm a portrait photographer." And that's just kind of just brushes all of those years of experience. Yeah. No, it's not enough. And I think actually, talking how you've just said is a really nice way to be able to do it without any kind of level of arrogance. I think it's a really nice way of doing it.
I appreciate we're about to stop, but just I sometimes use this word bookend. If you've got the opportunity to express what it is you're doing and the kind of work you do, to bookend with a recent project that you've just completed or a single picture that you've just shot 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago, and describe it, it goes so far to helping paint a picture in one's mind's eye. And I think that goes further than just reading a list of the type of pictures that you or the areas that you work in and the clients you work for. It's much more interesting.
Yeah. So I'd like to just quickly summarize it for the listeners, because I feel like we've covered so much in this conversation. So ultimately, for the takeaways for people here really are in order to build that confidence, you need to be gaining experience, and to go out and to be shooting, because there are going to be times in everyone's career and periods of life really where you might be quieter or you might be busier. I know a lot of photographers this year have been quite quiet, and that can lead to a degradation of confidence because you start to feel rusty, or you start to feel like you've not as well practiced as you might have been when you've been busy. And so, your advice in those situations is just to find stuff that you want to go and shoot and just do it. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't work. It doesn't matter if no one ever sees it, because you're still going to be exercising that muscle. And actually the process, they always say this with writers, if you want to write a novel, you've just got to do the time. You've just got to sit down and do your 2 or 3 hours every morning. And it doesn't matter if, it comes or it doesn't come that particular day. The process is just putting the time in, putting the hours in.
You've got to keep moving. I think that's the thing. If one can summarize it, stretch yourself at any point in your career, at all times in your career. Ask yourself the question, am I stretching myself beyond where I've currently been and where I feel comfortable? And keep moving. Keep shooting.
I think the only thing that I'd come back with that is quite interesting is how people square off, because so often the criticism I hear from people when you do start trying new stuff is people love to pigeonhole photographers, and people love to say you've got to have a specialism. And if you follow that advice too much, you end up choosing not to shoot projects because you think, well, actually, it's not what I do, because it's not what people think that I do. And for me, I've always tried to be more of a generalist in my approach to photography, because for me, it's not so much about the subject, it's about the way I shoot that. And I think it's important to be trying things that maybe aren't in your wheelhouse because they will stretch you, but not allowing the kind of external world to say, but you shouldn't be shooting that because you're a lifestyle photographer. You're not a sports photographer. You're not a portrait photographer or whatever.
The stretch can appear within any of these dimensions. It doesn't mean to say it goes outside your arena or so. I think the word stretch is each and every one is a personal challenge. It's basically challenging yourself within either the breadth of the arena that you shoot, or within the more specific that you shoot. But I think another, sorry, I know we've got to stop, Tom, but I think a really, really important thing I've always felt is that remembering that, you're a photographer because you want to express something through the medium of photography, not because you're interested in photography per se, that photography is your vehicle, and to know what it is you want to express is so important. And a lot of photographers don't spend enough time thinking about, what do I want to express through my photography? And Greg, you just talked about the fact that you're interested in shooting your subjects in a certain way, and people need to start to unpick what that means for them.
Yep.
Wise words.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I got nothing. That's a yeah, exactly. I will also say, just to lowbrow right at the very end, it also doesn't really matter what other people think. If you're proud of what you're creating and you're really into it, well, you do you. Your confidence on that work will take you a long way.
Absolutely, because it's not just about the work either. Gosh, I wish I'd said that earlier. It is so not just about the so-called quality of your photography. It's so much about how it's about you. It's about you and in your entirety. So yeah, please don't think that you've got to be the most outstanding photographer to be a success, whatever that measure of success is in your particular arena. But it is about you and your work. So we could carry on talking about this in so many ways, but yes, it's not just the photography. It's about you and how you express yourself and how you communicate it, and your life story that matters.
It sounds like we're in the making of a trilogy here, and there will be a part 3 to come in a few months' time.
I'm sure.
So, I mean, we've had you on before, as we mentioned, and obviously we're now going to inflict the same thing on you again. We're probably not going to ask you what your desert island camera is going to be this time.
No.
But we'd love to hear from you another photography book that you take on your desert island.
Well, I'm just reaching for it now, and it's so pertinent, and it's probably going to come up backwards, isn't it? It's the Photographer's Playbook. I wonder if this has come up before. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yes.
It's just
I nearly mentioned it earlier.
Did you?
When we were talking about it, stretching yourself.
Yeah, well, exactly. Look at all these marvellous little sort of post-its so the Photographer's Playbook is possibly the most valuable book any photographer can have on their shelf, in terms of when they feel flat or down or uninspired, or confidence is an issue, reach for this and push yourself to innovate with whatever it is you're doing, by reaching for a random page. It's a whole series of ideas that creative people have put forward to inspire photographers to create differently. That's all I'll say. And I mean, there's lots of fantastic ideas in there to help you to think, well, if I'm a portrait photographer, a lovely example is for a portrait photographer to actually have an audio session with a prospective subject or somebody they want to do a long form project with. This is not about taking pictures. It's simply about listening to their story so that you can then partly imagine and pre-visualize what kinds of pictures you might want to take. But it's about listening and hearing their story before you even meet them. So just a very interesting, and there are loads of marvelous examples in there of how to approach, all sorts of different types of photography. So I would highly recommend it. And it's published by Aperture, and it's called The Photographer's Playbook.
Nice.
We will link to that in the show
It
notes.
says 307 assignments and ideas. So
I
there
think
we
you
are.
say £307. Wow.
No,
You're not making any money.
no, it's a marvelous
Zoe,
book.
that's a really nice place to end it because it gives us listeners some homework, which, we always like to leave people with some things to go off and think about and to do. So thank you so much again for coming on today. It's been it's a real pleasure to have you back and to hear your pearls of wisdom. If people want to reach out to you and find out more, because obviously you do provide photography consultancy one-to-one, what's the best way that people can reach you and find you?
Well, the best way is to have a look at my website, which is zoewhishaw.com, and that tells you all about the kind of work I do and tells you how to get in touch, which is send me an email. But thank you actually to both of you and to Tom for inspiring me to reach out and suggest that this could be a really interesting topic because, I'm sure you don't feel confident all the time, but my goodness me, has your sort of experience over the years undoubtedly, developed to allow you to do that extraordinary work that you do.
Well, I'm useless. Like, people don't normally compliment me like that. So thank you very much. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Oh, you've made me blush, but thank God I'm in black and white. Cool. Well, Zoe, thank you ever so much. Well, an absolute pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for listening to the latest episode of the Exposed Negative podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that by heading to our Patreon or doing one-offs. The details are on the website, and the Patreon is patreon.com/exposed negative. We'd love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@exposed negative. And obviously, we're on Instagram, which is xnegative. If you want to follow us personally, mine is tombarnes.com on Instagram, as and the website. And then Greg's is @GregFennell, and that's FUNNELL. So, thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and hopefully you enjoy the next one.